Discipline is often praised as the cornerstone of success, yet most people misunderstand where it truly comes from. They believe it is a matter of willpower, a force summoned in moments of weakness. But willpower is unreliable. It fluctuates with mood, energy, and circumstance. What appears to be a failure of discipline is, more often, a failure of structure. Without structure, the mind is left to negotiate with itself constantly. Each decision becomes a battle, each action a test of strength. Over time, this drains even the most determined individuals. Structure, however, removes the need for repeated decisions. It creates a path that actions can follow automatically. When structure is absent, discipline must work over time. And eventually, it collapses. Not because the individual is weak, but because the system they rely on is broken. To understand discipline, one must first understand the architecture that supports it. The common belief that discipline is an internal trait, something you either possess or lack, is one of the most misleading ideas in modern self-development. It suggests that success depends primarily on character, on some invisible reserve of strength that can be summoned at will. But if this were true, discipline would be consistent. It would not vary from one day to another, nor would it collapse under minor disruptions. Yet this is precisely what happens. The same individual who performs with precision one week may falter the next. This inconsistency reveals a deeper truth: discipline is not the cause of action, but the byproduct of structure. Structure defines the environment in which decisions are made. It determines what is easy, what is difficult, and what is inevitable. When structure is strong, desired actions require little resistance. When it is weak, even simple tasks become burdens. Consider the difference between someone who prepares their environment in advance and someone who relies purely on intention. The former does not need to debate whether to act, the path is already laid out. The latter must continuously negotiate with distraction, fatigue, and impulse. In the absence of structure, every action becomes a choice, and every choice consumes energy. This is where discipline begins to erode. Not because the individual lacks strength, but because they are forced into an endless series of decisions. Each decision, no matter how small, draws from the same finite reserve. Over time, this reserve diminishes. What remains is hesitation, delay, and eventually, avoidance. This phenomenon explains why motivation often appears to disappear without warning. It is not that motivation has vanished, but that it has been depleted through repeated friction. Structure reduces this friction. It removes unnecessary decisions, narrows focus, and establishes a predictable rhythm of behavior. In doing so, it preserves the very energy that discipline depends on. A well-structured system transforms behavior from something reactive into something automatic. It creates conditions where the desired action is the default, not the exception. This is the critical distinction. When action is the default, discipline is rarely required. When action is optional, discipline must intervene repeatedly, and eventually, it fails. Many people attempt to solve this problem by increasing effort. They push harder, demand more from themselves, and interpret failure as a personal flaw. But this approach misunderstands the nature of the problem. Effort cannot compensate for structural weakness indefinitely. It is like trying to maintain balance on unstable ground. The more you strain, the more exhaustion sets in. Structure, on the other hand, stabilizes the ground itself. It eliminates unnecessary variables and reduces reliance on internal force. This is why individuals who appear highly disciplined often do not feel disciplined at all. Their systems carry the burden for them. Their routines, environments, and constraints guide behavior in a way that minimizes resistance. Without such systems, discipline becomes fragile. It is exposed to every fluctuation in mood, every unexpected disruption, every moment of doubt. It becomes something that must be constantly defended, rather than something that is quietly sustained. This leads to a critical realization: discipline is not something you build directly. It is something that emerges when structure is correctly designed, To pursue discipline without addressing structure is to treat the symptom while ignoring the cause. When structure is absent, failure is inevitable, not because the individual is incapable, but because the conditions for success do not exist. The mind, left without guidance, will always seek the path of least resistance. And without structure, that path rarely aligns with long-term intention. If discipline is not the source of consistent action, then what replaces it? The answer lies in the deliberate construction of constraints. Structure is not merely about organizing time or creating schedules, it is about reducing the number of decisions that must be made in the first place. Every decision introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty invites resistance. When the path forward is unclear, the mind hesitates. When hesitation becomes frequent, discipline begins to fracture. Constraints remove ambiguity. They define not only what should be done, but when, how, and under what conditions. This precision is what transforms intention into execution. A vague goal, such as be more productive, requires constant interpretation. A structured directive, anchored to a specific time, place, and action, requires none. It bypasses negotiation entirely. This is why individuals who rely on discipline alone often feel trapped in cycles of inconsistency. They approach each day as a fresh test, requiring renewed effort and renewed commitment. But this repeated reset is itself the problem. Without continuity, there is no accumulation of stability. Each day begins from zero, and each decision carries the full weight of uncertainty. Structure, by contrast, creates continuity. It links actions across time, forming patterns that the mind can follow without resistance. These patterns reduce cognitive load, allowing behavior to unfold with minimal interference. The more consistent the structure, the less discipline is required to sustain it. It is important to understand that structure does not restrict freedom in the way many assume. On the contrary, it preserves it. By eliminating trivial decisions, it frees mental capacity for what truly matters. Without structure, the mind becomes occupied with constant micro-decisions: when to start, what to do next, whether to continue. These decisions consume attention that could otherwise be directed toward meaningful work. There is also a deeper psychological effect at play. When structure is present, the individual experiences a sense of inevitability. Actions feel less like choices and more like natural progressions. This shift in perception is subtle but powerful. It reduces internal conflict, making execution feel less like effort and more like alignment. In contrast, the absence of structure creates a fragmented mental state. The individual is pulled in multiple directions, with no clear hierarchy of action. Urgent tasks override important ones, distractions appear equally valid as responsibilities, and time becomes reactive rather than intentional. In such an environment, discipline is forced into a defensive role, constantly resisting, constantly correcting, and inevitably, becoming exhausted. One of the most overlooked aspects of structure is its role in shaping identity. Repeated actions, performed within a stable framework, reinforce a consistent sense of self. The individual begins to see themselves as someone who acts in a certain way, not because they exert effort, but because it is what they do. This identity-based reinforcement further reduces reliance on discipline, as behavior becomes self-confirming. However, without structure, identity remains unstable. Actions are inconsistent, and self-perception shifts accordingly. One day of failure can overshadow multiple days of progress, not because it carries more weight, but because there is no structural continuity to absorb it. The result is a cycle of doubt, where discipline is not only weakened but undermined. It is also worth noting that structure must be intentional. It does not emerge naturally from desire alone. Left unmanaged, the environment will default to convenience, not alignment. This means that without deliberate design, the path of least resistance will rarely support long-term objectives. To build structure is to pre-decide behavior. It is to remove future uncertainty by establishing present clarity. This clarity is what discipline depends on. Without it, discipline is forced to operate in an environment of constant ambiguity, a condition under which it cannot sustain itself. Ultimately, the question is not how to become more disciplined, but how to make discipline unnecessary. The answer lies in constructing systems where the correct action is not the hardest choice, but the easiest one. Where behavior flows not from effort, but from design. Even when the importance of structure is understood, many fail at the point of implementation. They attempt to impose rigid systems abruptly, expecting immediate transformation. But structure that is not aligned with reality becomes another source of resistance. It is abandoned not because structure is ineffective, but because it was imposed without regard for existing patterns of behavior. Structure must be introduced with precision. It should not aim to control every aspect of behavior at once, but to stabilize key points of instability. These points are often predictable: the beginning of the day, transitions between tasks, and moments of fatigue. It is here that discipline is most frequently required, and most likely to fail. By reinforcing these moments with clear, predefined actions, structure begins to take hold where it is needed most. A common mistake is to design structure around ideal conditions rather than actual ones. Plans are made based on how one wishes to behave, not how one consistently behaves. This creates a mismatch between system and reality. When the system is activated, it collides with existing habits, and friction emerges immediately. Discipline is then called upon to bridge the gap, but as established, discipline is not a reliable bridge. Effective structure works with current behavior, not against it. It acknowledges existing tendencies and redirects them rather than attempting to eliminate them outright. This approach reduces resistance and allows change to occur incrementally. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate, reshaping behavior without requiring excessive force. Another critical factor is visibility. Structure must be externalized to remain effective. When it exists only as an internal intention, it is subject to reinterpretation. The mind, under pressure, will modify plans to reduce discomfort. What was once a clear directive becomes flexible, then optional, and finally ignored. Externalizing structure, through written plans, environmental cues, or physical arrangements, prevents this drift. Environment plays a decisive role in reinforcing structure. It can either support or undermine it. An environment filled with distractions, ambiguity, and competing signals will constantly disrupt even the most carefully designed systems. Conversely, an environment aligned with structure reduces the need for intervention. It acts as a silent guide, directing behavior without conscious effort. This is why minor adjustments in environment often produce disproportionate results. Removing a single source of distraction, or introducing a single cue, can shift behavior more effectively than increased effort. These changes are subtle, but they alter the conditions under which decisions are made. And as conditions change, so does behavior. Consistency, however, is the factor that determines whether structure endures. A system followed intermittently is not a system, it is an experiment. For structure to replace discipline, it must be applied repeatedly until it becomes the default framework for action. This repetition does not require intensity, but stability. It is not about doing more, but about doing the same thing without deviation. During this phase, discipline still plays a role, but it is a transitional one. It is used not to sustain behavior indefinitely, but to establish structure until it can sustain itself. This distinction is crucial. Discipline is the initial force that sets the system in motion, but it is not the mechanism that keeps it running. There will inevitably be moments where structure breaks, unexpected events, disruptions, or lapses in attention. These moments are not failures of discipline, but interruptions in structure. The response to them determines whether the system recovers or collapses. If the reaction is to abandon the system entirely, then structure was never fully established. If the response is to return to the predefined path, continuity is preserved. This ability to return is more important than the ability to maintain perfection. Structure does not require flawless execution. It requires reliable recovery. Each return reinforces the system, strengthening its presence over time. Ultimately, the goal is not to create a system that demands constant awareness, but one that operates with minimal supervision. When structure reaches this level, discipline becomes largely irrelevant. Actions occur not because they are forced, but because there is no alternative path presented. At this point, what once required effort becomes automatic. And what once depended on discipline is now sustained by design. As structure begins to replace discipline, a subtle shift occurs in how effort is experienced. What once felt like resistance gradually transforms into neutrality, and eventually, into ease. This transition is often misunderstood, because many expect progress to always feel demanding. But in reality, the highest form of efficiency is not intensity, it is the absence of friction. Friction is the hidden cost of poor structure. It appears in the form of hesitation, distraction, and delay. It is not always visible, but it is always present when action feels unnecessarily difficult. Each moment of friction introduces a pause, and within that pause, alternative choices emerge. These alternatives are rarely aligned with long-term objectives. They are shaped by comfort, convenience, and immediate reward. Structure eliminates these pauses by narrowing the field of available choices. It does not rely on suppressing alternatives, but on preventing them from appearing in the first place. When the next action is already defined, the mind does not search for options. It proceeds. This directness is what removes friction at its source. However, many attempt to reduce friction by increasing motivation. They seek stronger reasons, deeper purpose, or greater emotional intensity. While these can produce temporary bursts of action, they do not address the underlying instability. Motivation fluctuates, and when it declines, friction returns with greater force. Structure, by contrast, does not depend on emotional states. It operates independently of them. Another important distinction is between complexity and effectiveness. There is a tendency to over-engineer systems, adding layers of rules, tools, and optimizations in the hope of achieving better results. But complexity often reintroduces friction. The more elements a system contains, the more points of failure it creates. When execution becomes complicated, hesitation returns. Effective structure is simple. It focuses on clarity rather than completeness. It defines essential actions and removes everything that does not directly support them. This simplicity makes the system resilient. It can be followed even in conditions of low energy, distraction, or stress, precisely the conditions under which discipline would normally fail. There is also a temporal dimension to structure that is frequently overlooked. Actions are not isolated events, they exist within sequences. The end of one action should naturally lead to the beginning of the next. When these transitions are undefined, gaps emerge. And within those gaps, friction accumulates. By designing clear transitions, structure maintains momentum. It ensures that behavior flows continuously, without requiring reinitiation. This continuity is critical. Starting is always more difficult than continuing. A system that minimizes the need to start repeatedly will always outperform one that relies on frequent initiation. This is why routines are so powerful. Not because they enforce repetition, but because they create predictable sequences. Each step prepares the next, reducing the cognitive effort required to proceed. Over time, these sequences become ingrained, operating with little to no conscious involvement. Yet structure must remain adaptive. Rigid systems that cannot adjust to changing conditions eventually break. Adaptation does not mean abandoning structure, but refining it. When friction reappears, it signals a misalignment between system and reality. This misalignment must be corrected, not ignored. The process of refinement is continuous. It requires observation, not judgment. When a system fails, the question is not why did I lack discipline? But where did the structure fail to support the action? This shift in perspective transforms failure into feedback. It directs attention toward design rather than self-criticism. Over time, this approach builds systems that are both stable and flexible. They provide enough structure to guide behavior, but enough adaptability to remain functional under varying conditions. This balance is what allows structure to endure. At its highest level, structure becomes invisible. It no longer feels like a system being followed, but like a natural way of operating. Decisions are minimal, transitions are seamless, and actions occur without internal resistance. Discipline, once seen as essential, fades into the background. What remains is consistency, not enforced, but embedded. And this consistency is not the result of strength, but of design that eliminates the need for strength. At the final stage of understanding, the relationship between discipline and structure reveals a complete inversion of what most people assume. Discipline is not the foundation upon which structure is built. It is the temporary scaffold used to construct it. Once the structure is stable, the scaffold is no longer needed. Yet many never reach this stage because they remain fixated on strengthening the scaffold instead of completing the structure. This fixation creates a cycle of dependence. Each time discipline is required, it reinforces the belief that discipline is the solution. But this belief ensures that the underlying problem remains unaddressed. The individual becomes more skilled at exerting effort, but no closer to eliminating the need for it. Over time, this leads to exhaustion, not mastery. True stability is achieved when behavior is no longer contingent on internal states. When action does not depend on how one feels, how motivated one is, or how much energy is available, consistency becomes inevitable. This is the defining characteristic of a well-constructed system. It operates independently of fluctuation. To reach this level, one must shift focus from intensity to reliability. Intensity seeks immediate results, often through force. Reliability seeks continuity, often through simplicity. These approaches are not compatible. Systems built on intensity tend to collapse under variability, while systems built on reliability adapt and persist. Reliability is established through repetition under stable conditions. The same actions, performed in the same context, at the same time, gradually reduce the need for conscious involvement. This process is not dramatic, but it is decisive. Each repetition strengthens the structure, making deviation less likely. An important aspect of this process is the removal of optionality. As long as an action is perceived as optional, it remains vulnerable to negotiation. And negotiation is where discipline is consumed. Structure eliminates this negotiation by defining clear, non-negotiable points of action. These points act as anchors, stabilizing behavior regardless of circumstance. However, non-negotiability must be applied carefully. If it is imposed without consideration for capacity, it creates strain. And strain reintroduces resistance. Effective structure balances firmness with feasibility. It sets standards that can be met consistently, not occasionally. This consistency is what builds trust in the system. Trust is a critical, often overlooked component. When a system proves reliable over time, the individual begins to rely on it. There is less questioning, less hesitation, and less need for reinforcement. The system becomes self-validating. This trust reduces cognitive load further, allowing attention to shift away from execution and toward refinement. At this stage, improvement becomes a matter of adjustment rather than effort. Small changes in timing, sequence, or environment can produce significant gains. Because the foundation is stable, these adjustments do not disrupt the system, they enhance it. This is where optimization becomes meaningful. Without structure, optimization is ineffective. There is nothing stable to improve. Each attempt to refine behavior is undermined by inconsistency. But with structure in place, refinement compounds. Each improvement builds upon the last, creating momentum that does not rely on discipline to sustain it. It is also here that the distinction between control and guidance becomes clear. Discipline attempts to control behavior directly. It applies force to produce action. Structure, on the other hand, guides behavior indirectly. It shapes the conditions under which action occurs. This guidance is more subtle, but far more effective. Control requires constant input. Guidance requires initial design. Once the design is established, it continues to function with minimal intervention. This is the efficiency that structure provides. It replaces ongoing effort with upfront clarity. Ultimately, the goal is not to become a more disciplined person, but to become a more deliberate designer of one's environment and systems. This shift removes the burden of constant self-regulation and replaces it with predictable, repeatable patterns. When structure reaches its full expression, discipline is no longer a requirement for consistency. It becomes a reserve, used only when systems are being built or rebuilt, not when they are functioning as intended. And in this state, what once felt like a struggle becomes something far simpler, a process that unfolds as designed, requiring no force to sustain it. The failure of discipline is rarely a reflection of personal weakness. It is a reflection of structural absence. When systems are undefined, decisions multiply. When decisions multiply, energy depletes. And when energy depletes, discipline collapses under a burden it was never designed to carry. Throughout this progression, the pattern remains consistent. Where there is no structure, there is friction. Where there is friction, there is hesitation. And where there is hesitation, discipline is forced into constant use, until it inevitably fails. This cycle cannot be broken by increasing effort. It can only be resolved by changing the conditions in which action occurs. Structure is not a constraint imposed on behavior, it is the framework that allows behavior to stabilize. It removes unnecessary choice, defines clear paths, and creates continuity across time. In doing so, it transforms action from something that must be forced into something that can be followed. The shift is subtle but decisive. Instead of asking how to become more disciplined, the focus turns to how to make discipline unnecessary. This is achieved not through intensity, but through deliberate design, of environment, of sequence, and of constraint. When structure is present, consistency emerges naturally. Not because the individual has become stronger, but because the system no longer requires strength to function. Discipline, then, is not the solution. It is the signal. A signal that structure is missing. And where structure is built, discipline is no longer needed.